Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And today we're going to travel for the first time to Egypt, where we're going to learn about the Siege of Avaris around 1550 BCE, in which Pharaoh Ahmose I defeated the Hyksos and maybe kicked him out of Egypt. It certainly wasn't the first battle in ancient Egypt, but it is the first one we have anything like a name and a date for. Now this one could be interesting because Avaris was a city in the Nile Delta, surrounded by the river on one side and probably protected by marshy wetlands on the land side, which means this could be our first amphibious action, meaning we would see fighting on both land and water. Unfortunately, we don't have that level of detail in the records. This is one of those battles where we know who was there, more or less when it happened, and how it turned out. And that's about it. The joys of trying to analyze battles from the Bronze Age. But anyway, like always, we need to do a little bit of background before we can get to the battle. Because this is the first time we've been to ancient Egypt, and the first time we're going to talk about naval warfare. Which means, before we can talk about the battle, we need to talk about Egypt and boats. After that, we'll need to talk a little bit about Ahmose I, and then about who the Hyksos were. And then we can get to the battle. So, buckle up. First, we need to talk about ancient Egypt. And in order to do that, we need to do a quick geography lesson. The Egyptian culture developed in the Nile Valley and pretty much nowhere else. Why? Because the Nile, the world's longest river, runs through the Sahara, the world's largest desert. Yes, there are people who live in the Sahara and on its edges, but there aren't enough of them, and they haven't left enough evidence of themselves to really say anything about their historical culture. The Egyptians, on the other hand, left us a metric shit ton of evidence, and the culture they developed is unlike any other culture in the world. So they're the ones we study and talk about. Right, Nile Valley. So people have to live where there's water. It's kind of important for staying alive, and it makes growing and finding food much easier. And there's a lot of water in the Nile. Even more importantly, it floods every year, which brings fertile soil to what we call its floodplain. Fertile soil means we can grow crops in it. So you have a long strip of fertile land running right along the river with desert on either side of it. And it's in that long, narrow strip that the Egyptian culture developed. If you look at a map of the Egyptian civilization, you can see it. All the cities, all the amazing artifacts are within a few miles of the river, with only a couple of exceptions. One other geographical note, and we'll get on with it. The Nile flows from the south to the north, out of the highlands of what was Nubia and is now Sudan, to eventually empty into the Mediterranean, which looks weird to North American eyes. It's pretty easy for us to accept a river that runs either way when it's sideways on a map, but when we see a river that goes up and down on the map, our brains want it to be running from north to south. So you're going to have to remind your brain. When we talk about Upper Egypt or the Upper Nile, we're talking about the southern part, because that's where the elevation is higher. Lower Egypt, then, is the northern part, closer to the Mediterranean. So now we've got that clear, let's get on with it. Like Mesopotamia, this area has been settled since the Stone Age, but the culture we think of as Egyptian began to develop in the 4th millennium BCE. Just like in Mesopotamia and China, the history we have from the earliest records is fragmentary and full of legend and myth. But here's a whirlwind tour of what we do have. Sometime around 3250 BCE, a king called Scorpion I, not to be confused with the Rock, is supposed to have unified Upper Egypt. Around 3100 BCE, Narmer annexed Lower Egypt to turn the two regions into a single kingdom. Narmer is considered the founder of the first dynasty, something like the George Washington of ancient Egypt. Also around 3100 BCE, the second pharaoh, Hor-Aha, may have invaded Nubia. It's not likely these two pharaohs did their thing in the same year, It's just that sometime around 3100 BCE is the closest we can get for a real date for these two dudes. The first dynasty came to an end around 2900 BCE with a civil war between two pharaohs called Horus and Sneferka. It looks like the kingdom was reunified under a whole different pharaoh called, and I'm going to have to play with this one a little bit, Hotep Sekemui, founder of the second dynasty. Don't worry, we're not going to go through every dynasty on the way to the battle. The first pharaoh of the fourth dynasty, Sneferu, appears to have pushed against his neighbors a little bit around 2600 BCE, leading military campaigns in Nubia, Libya, and the Levant. This is around the same time the Siege of Uruk, our first Bronze Age battle, may have happened. Then around 2000 BCE, a guy named Segerseni attacked Lower Egypt, probably from Nubia. It doesn't look like he was an actual pharaoh, but he attacked at the breakpoint between the 11th and 12th dynasties. So either he managed to kill or force out the last pharaoh of the 11th dynasty, Mentuhotep IV, or he was trying to take advantage of some confusion that came from the pharaoh's death. Whichever it was, he didn't manage to take over Egypt. There don't seem to be any records of him outside Nubia. Finally, the military picture is pretty sketchy from 2000 to 1550 BCE and the battle we're talking about today, the Siege of Avaris. So here's a teaser. Ahmose I, founder of the 18th dynasty, is the pharaoh who's about to attack Avaris. But before we can get to that, we need to talk about boats and naval warfare. I'm sure you've already figured out why boats would be important for a culture like Egypt, a civilization that grows up in a river valley, especially on the longest river in the world, especially when that river is the only source of life for that civilization, is going to learn how to use the river for more than just food and water. It's a natural highway, one you don't have to clear land for, or haul gravel for, or even stomp down. But to use it, you have to have boats. I mean, have you seen the size of a Nile crocodile? You wouldn't want to have to swim with one of those monsters. So, the boats the Egyptians used to navigate the Nile were made of papyrus reeds. That doesn't sound like a very robust material to make a boat out of, but they figured it out. They used everything from 10-foot 1 or 2 man craft to 30-foot beasts driven by a dozen rowers or more. Now, a boat made out of reed bundles is great for a river, but not so good for the Mediterranean. To navigate the ocean, you need something a little tougher. So they figured out how to build boats out of wood. But you might wonder where they got the wood. It doesn't seem likely that trees suitable for shipbuilding would be very common in the Nile Valley. But once again, they figured it out. And remember the trade networks we've talked about in previous episodes? It turns out there are cedar forests in Lebanon even today, and back in the 2nd and 3rd millennium BCE, those forests provided a lot of the timber that built the Egyptian navy and trading fleet. And once they figure out how to build wooden boats, they can start making them bigger. It looks like the biggest boat the ancient Egyptians ever built was a barge constructed around 1500 BCE to move 2 giant stone obelisks, each one weighing something like 330 tons. I couldn't find the dimensions, and it sounds like there's some disagreement on whether or not the boat actually existed, but if it did, it weighed in at something like 700 tons. That's a pretty big boat. And to dig this nerd hole just a little deeper, just in case you didn't know, when you hear somebody talking about how big a ship is, the size they give in tons is the amount of water the ship displaces. Now, the way buoyancy works, in order for an object to float, it has to weigh less than the amount of water it displaces. So a ship like the barge we're talking about has to weigh less than 700 tons in order to float. Seems like this one's cutting it pretty close, especially when you load it down. That's just a little nerd seasoning. It really doesn't bear on today's battle, except that the Egyptians are going to be using these wooden boats to attack Avaris. And they're not just propelled by rowers. A lot of the Egyptian ships had masts and could be sailed as well as rowed. Some even had a pretty cool arrangement where the mast had 2 legs and could be folded down over the top of the ship when it wasn't in use. Okay, Scott, enough about the boats. Let's get on with the story. Who's fighting who today and why? Well, it's interesting to note that where Mesopotamia kind of fell into a highly decentralized model of government, with all the different city-states constantly measuring dicks and trying to climb to the top of the heap, the Egyptians took a very different approach. They adopted a centralized model very early, and the Egyptian pharaoh seems to have had near absolute power for pretty much their entire history until Rome took over in 30 BCE. Starting with Narmer, that's more than 3,000 years. That's longer than China was unified under one emperor. Not a bad run. I already mentioned the pharaoh who's going to be leading the troops on the Egyptian side. Ahmose I was the first pharaoh of what we call the 18th dynasty. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any kind of juicy story around his ascension. He's the founder of the 18th dynasty because his father was pharaoh and his brother Ahmose was the last pharaoh of the 17th dynasty. I guess he had to start a new dynasty because Ahmose died without a son and the throne passed to him as the next in line, even though he wasn't the son of the reigning pharaoh. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Egyptian succession rules. We're here for the battle, right? So not only is Ahmose I the founder of the 18th dynasty, he's also the first pharaoh of what we call the New Kingdom, which is the period when most of what folks like you and me know about Egypt's history happened. The New Kingdom was when Egypt's empire expanded to its greatest extent, and it's when most of the famous pharaohs like Tutankhamun and Ramses II reigned. And it all kind of starts with today's battle. Okay, just a couple more minutes of background and we'll get to the scrap, because we haven't talked about Ahmose's enemies yet. So the people living in Avaris when Ahmose took the throne were called the Hyksos. Now Hyksos is what we call them today, but it's really just the Greek version of an Egyptian word that means rulers from foreign lands. So when we call them Hyksos, we're really just calling them carpetbaggers. It's not clear to me what the Hyksos called themselves, but it probably wasn't carpetbaggers. Their origins aren't clear either, but it looks like they came to Egypt from somewhere in Mesopotamia or the Levant in the 1640s BCE. They may have been Canaanites or Amorites or some other flavor of Semites. They may have invaded and taken over Lower Egypt by force, remember that's the northern part, or they may have just immigrated in greater and greater numbers until it just made sense for them to take a hand in governing the lands they had settled in. And it looks like the Hyksos laid a lot of the groundwork for the Egyptian empire that would rise in the next 100 years or so. You may have noticed that the Egyptians up to this point had been pretty inward focused, which makes sense because they lived in a river valley surrounded by one of the biggest, baddest deserts on the planet. They were pretty well cut off from the rest of the world. But the Hyksos changed that arrangement because they kept in contact with their former neighbors, or maybe family members in Mesopotamia, maintaining trading networks and communications with the Amorites and probably the states of the Levant as well. And when the Egyptians kicked them out, spoiler alert, they seem to have kept those networks alive. So we can probably thank the Hyksos for Egyptian expansion into the Sinai and then up into the Levant. They also probably introduced the horse and chariot to Egypt, which would help explain why the Egyptians decided to start expanding around this period. Did I mention they wore afros? Well, maybe not afros, but their sculptures show them wearing hairstyles that made their heads look like mushrooms. Anyway, the Hyksos king's name was Kamudi. I know pretty much nothing else about him, and it looks like this fight occurred in the 11th year of Kamudi's reign and the 18th year of Ahmose's. Enough background, yeah? Enough background. Let's get to the battle. I'm going to do my best here, but just like so many other battles from this period, the records we have don't tell us much. No shit, there they were. So it was actually Ahmose's father, Seqenenre-Tao, who started the war. He decided sometime during his reign that he was sick and fucking tired of these carpetbaggers running the lower part of what ought to be his damn kingdom. So he started taking over the cities the Hyksos ruled. And they kicked his ass for it. He reigned 5 or 10 years before he died in the Axe wounds in his mummy show pretty clearly that somebody wasn't very happy with him. Historians think he died in battle against the Hyksos. So his son Ahmose took the throne and continued the war. In his third year, he launched a campaign north from the city of Memphis to start taking Hyksos-held cities. He sailed down the Nile with a fleet, and he seems to have followed kind of a blitzkrieg-style strategy. He hit small settlements hard and overwhelmed them, but didn't waste time attacking harder targets like bigger cities. Instead, you just isolate those and move on to the next target. This would have allowed him to move downriver fast without spending time fighting the larger garrisons because they were bottled up behind their walls. Of course, he would have to deal with them eventually, but if his blocking forces did their jobs right, they'd be hungry by the time he got to them. And if he could take the Hyksos capital at Avaris, the other cities might just give up without a fight. But Ahmose didn't live to see his strategy pay off. He intercepted a message from the Hyksos king to the Kush, the people we also call Nubians, who lived on the upper Nile south of Egypt. And it looks like he turned his army around so he could go spank the Kush and remove their threat to his rear. And sometime after turning south to deal with the Kush, he died after a rule of maybe 3 to 5 years. So Ahmose I took the throne. As we've already said, he was Ahmose's brother, so not a descendant. And he was probably about 10 years old when his brother died, which means there's no way he led an army to conquer Avaris in the first few years of his reign. Instead, it looks like his mother, Ahotep, ruled as regent while Ahmose was growing up. Now, you don't see the kind of misogyny in Egyptian records that you do in, say, the later Roman records. The Egyptians were always more accepting of powerful women than many of the cultures that came after them. And Ahotep was just the kind of powerful woman the Egyptians admired. Not only did she keep things under control while the country waited for Ahmose to reach his majority, it looks like she brought the Egyptians together to a greater degree than they had been before. There's a stele in Egypt that says, "Her name is renowned in every land. She knows matters and upholds Egypt. She has united its officer class. She has returned its deserters and gathers its dissidents. She has pacified Upper Egypt, and she quells its rebels." So she settled quite a few disputes among Egyptians, strengthened the military, and maybe even put down a rebellion while serving as her son's regent. And it looks like neither the Hyksos nor the Nubians tried anything while she was in charge, so that says something about what they thought about her. And she might have continued serving after Ahmose reached his majority. There's some evidence that she stayed in control of the administrative and logistical side of the government so he could focus on taking down the Hyksos. And sometime in the 18th year of his reign, Ahmose resumed his brother's campaign against the Hyksos. So I couldn't find a record about the Hyksos reoccupying or reconquering the cities they had lost to Ahmose. That means either they didn't try, preferring just to hunker down in the places they still held, or they tried but they couldn't get it done because Ahmose and/or Ahotep made it impossible, or they took them back but the historians didn't bother to record it, or the records have been lost. I'm going to say that Ahotep made sure those cities were fortified and garrisoned strongly enough that the Hyksos couldn't take them back. So Ahmose didn't have to worry about any Hyksos cities south of the capital, Avaris. But he didn't rush into the attack. He used his head. Before going after Avaris, he turned east and took the city of Jaru, which sat on the road from Egypt to Canaan. That isolated Avaris by land from any help that might come from that way. I can't find a source that says he secured the water approaches to the city, but that would have been key to putting the city under siege. So the details of the siege itself are pretty sketchy, but we have a source called Ahmose, son of Ibana, who was there. He was a sailor in Ahmose's navy for the siege, and he went on to serve for the rest of Ahmose's reign and the next two pharaohs, Amenhotep I and Thutmose I as well. But according to Ahmose, the sailor, not the pharaoh, the Egyptians attacked Avaris 3 times. Then Ahmose, the pharaoh, had to turn back south to put down a rebellion before he could take the city. That done, he headed back to Avaris for a 4th attack. Turned out this one was for real. So how'd he do it? Well, this is another one of those battles where we can't answer that question, because if anybody wrote down the tactical details, we've lost them sometime in the last 3,500 years. But we can make a reasonable guess. First, we can shit-can one description of the battle that we know didn't happen. A Greek-Egyptian historian called Manetho, who wrote his history 1,200 years after the battle, claimed that Ahmose laid siege to the city with 480,000 men. Now, a number like that would be semi-plausible during some parts of Roman history, plausible in much of Chinese history, and semi-reasonable in some of the wars of the 19th and 20th centuries. But in Egypt in 1550 BCE, nuh-uh. The highest Egyptians' population ever got during the New Kingdom period was somewhere between 3 and 5 million. That means for that number to be accurate, Ahmose would have had to attack Avaris with north of 10% of his entire population. To put that in perspective, in order to field 10% of our population, the United States would have to put something like 35 million people under arms. We'd have to take them away from their homes and families, away from their jobs, and then feed them, and pay them, and house them, and equip them, and put clothes on their bodies. Yes, 35 million people would be the biggest damn hammer the world has ever seen. If you can get them where you want them, and then coordinate their efforts when they get there. And did I mention you have to take them away from their jobs? Yeah. You don't send 10% of your population to war unless it doesn't matter if you torpedo your economy. I expect it probably mattered to Ahmose, because it doesn't look like this was a war for Egypt's survival. So whatever he attacked with, it was less than 480,000. Just pulling a number out of my ass, I'm going to say he had somewhere between 10 and 20,000. Maybe as many as 50,000, but moving that many people by boat is going to get tricky pretty quick. We don't have a detailed map of the city or the area around it, but we know it sat on the east side of the Nile Delta. So we can imagine what the environment was like. A river delta is more or less a wetland area with multiple channels fed by the river fanning out across a wide area. Between the channels, you'll have islands of dry land lying between the river channels and marshy areas. The river channels move year to year because the water level rises in the wet season when the river floods and falls again when it's dry. Any city in an environment like this is going to sit on one of these islands, and a big part of their annual work in the dry season is going to be digging and clearing and dredging canals to keep the river's channels in predictable places when the water rises. The city might be an island during the flood season, or it might have a raised causeway connecting it with the mainland. So you might be able to put an army on the causeway for a land assault, but to really invest the city, you're going to need boats. And Ahmose had boats. This was his Nile after all. But this was not going to be an easy nut to crack. Avaris might have been the biggest city in the world in 1550 BCE, and whether or not that's true, it had its own harbor, it had a stout city wall, and a brand new citadel the Hyksos built when they learned Ahmose was coming. So trying to storm it is a bad idea, and you can't pull a Hammurabi and flood it. Honestly, the best way to take a beast like this would have been to cut it off and wait it out, which is why we call this a siege and not a sack or a battle or a destruction. And the best time to pull up and put this town under siege would have been at the end of the flood season, when the waters started to go down and the city started looking for resupply. This gives you a few benefits. The receding waters make it easier to land large numbers of troops far enough from the walls that the archers can't take them out. The slower currents will make it easier to control your boats and keep them where they need to be. And the city is going to start to feel the effects of hunger sooner, because they expected to be isolated during the flood season, but not much longer than that. And when the supply ships show up with the town's food, you can take it for your army and navy instead. So that's probably what Ahmose did. I can't find a source to tell me how long the siege lasted, but it may have been kind of anticlimactic because archaeologists haven't found any evidence of burning or other forms of destruction at Avaris. They may have fought a naval battle or a land battle or both outside the city before the Hyksos retreated inside. But it looks like the Hyksos figured out pretty quick that they weren't going to get out of this one in one piece, decided they never really liked Egypt anyway, and headed back to Canaan. For his part, Ahmose probably would have welcomed a surrender like that, and may even have been the one to offer terms, because that would have accomplished his goal without the high casualties of an assault or an expensive rebuilding effort in Avaris. Hell, it's even possible, based on the archaeological evidence, that the Hyksos just stepped down from their leadership and stayed where they were, now governed by Egyptians. It's also possible that Egyptian forces took the town when loyalists opened the gate for them, and they left the population alone and just massacred the carpetbaggers. But however it happened, when the siege was over, Ahmose held Avaris, and Upper and Lower Egypt reunited again. Now, there's a big question mark here that we're going to get into when we talk about the Siege of Sharuhen, where Ahmose I supposedly invaded the Levant in order to wipe out the Hyksos once and for all. But if that was necessary, why would he have accepted a peaceful withdrawal from Avaris? We'll dive into that question in the next episode. Well, you knew this was coming. We don't know enough about this battle to do a scorecard. It's too bad, too. An amphibious assault is an interesting kind of action to analyze, and this might have been a great example for us. But we'll get there. So if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And make sure you tell your friends about me. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.